Hello, my name is Chris Blask, and you have landed somewhere along the inevitability curve. In this series, we talk to interesting folks about hopefully interesting topics, looking at where we've been in the past, how we got to where we are right now, perhaps what that looks like, and with that, maybe some idea of where we're going in the future. So joining me today is Emerson Tan. How are you, Emerson?
Hello, I'm in sunny Washington, D.C., stuck in a basement because that apparently is a good place to ride out a crisis. I think that's
Which one?
tradition now.
Right. So speaking of crises, so I normally do a lot of intro stuff into this, but I don't know how to describe your background. You're sort of emergency response, cyber, economics guru from hell. What do you do?
So goodness. So these days I run my own little. I have my own little fintech firm which builds payment technologies for the developing world, but also like disaster resilient and crisis resilient payment technologies. But my career history is somewhat insane because I started out in computer security and the whole hacking world before such things were a crime. I'm a lot older than I look. The reason I save the sides of my head is because that's where all the white bits are. And from there, my career took me into the world of national security and cyber warfare. For about a decade, I was the head of external research and development for one of the first companies that ever produced cyber warfare anything for the Five Eyes. And in parallel to that, then I've also got a 20-something odd year career in humanitarian aid and disaster management. And all of those things have kind of come together to sort of like really my interest in resilience and disaster and crisis management. Academically, I studied planetary sciences at University College London.
Which makes perfect sense. Linear path, I can see it.
Yeah. It's like Earth and space science. Like computer hacking, cyber warfare,
humanitarian emergency response
and stuff, and
that is such the thing. I still get excited about getting on airplanes, right? You try to keep in mind the fact that I get to drink coffee at 30,000-40,000 feet at just below the speed of sound, which is kind of unique in the history of history. But this getting to do what we do, every Rakesh Brania, mutual friend, was on. We had one of these conversations a couple of weeks ago, and it's just amazing. None of us. I don't. I think I'm just lucky. I forced got my way through everything. I don't have a high school diploma. How did I get here? I don't know. But one of the defining characteristics about what I consider my community is that everybody's sort of like, am I really? Is this real? Am I really? I'm in the White House, or I'm in wherever we get to, and it's like, really. So following that path, right? This again, and this whole inevitability curve thing goes back to 1991, 92, and I was trying to explain to my boss. Let's stop arguing about it. Let's assume for a second that everybody on Earth is on the internet, say 20, 30 years from now. There's a line at that point you can look back. We'll all be sitting there looking back and say, in the distant future of 2024, looking back and say, oh, here's how it happened.
Yeah. And it's all inevitable. It's like preordained in some.
Once you get there.
Yeah. Once you get there. Exactly.
So on this, I've done a bunch of these sort of pieces, over the last number of years anyway. So in this series, just digging into it for half an hour, saying, all right, where have we been? Where are we right now? Where are we going? And, with your background, we can take it any way we want, but, it's hurricane season. We've got all sorts of disasters. We've got Helene is, we're dealing with the outcome of that. And Milton's about to take out my boats in Florida, plus a lot of people's, lives and livelihoods. And we've been responding to disasters. We've been having disasters literally forever.
Yep.
And in our working lifetimes in the green room, we were talking about this a little bit just now. Things have gotten better, worse, different, right? And they're going someplace.
Yeah, different. I mean, so one of the things that's really, really clear, at least, so like if you come to climate change the effects of our pollution as humans, if you come to that as from the perspective of someone whose science background wasn't particularly great, right? This probably looks either terribly overblown or like terrifying, or some conversation, some like you seesaw between these two emotions. If you come from this from like someone who has a good understanding of like geological science and is kept up to date, and if you come to this with someone with like a planetary sciences background, then what this is actually it is about that inevitability curve, because at this point it's not like the 1960s where everyone was like, oh my god, like the world is going to starve because we're going to run out of phosphate or this and that, right? Or the world can only support 3 billion people, da 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 da. This is actually all about physics. And one of the things that people don't properly grok is that the cold state that humans evolved in is not Earth's default state. Earth's default state is pretty warm. It has, for most of its history, Earth has had no ice at the poles. And for most of its history, it has had life forms at latitudes that you just wouldn't think of. So, I mean, like, the closest analogy of where we're going is probably the early Miocene. The early Miocene, it was quite a few degrees warmer than it is now. It had giant snapping river turtles in Berlin. Horses were about this big, and it was significantly warmer. One of the reasons that we have not really sort of clocked all of this is that the techniques to actually look at the temperature record are actually very, very, very new. I mean, like, we're talking, like less than 50 years old to get down to the sort of like fine grain resolution that you actually need to have to actually sort of like drill into these things. And, it's all so new that, in fact, actually a lot of the analysis just simply hasn't been done. But the physics will tell you that, like, if you go and shove a bunch of extra CO2 into the air, then you will end up with radiative forcing. And that's actually an experiment that you can do on your countertop with a couple of soda pop bottles, some water, a bit of sodium bicarbonate, and like a couple of thermometers. In fact, actually, I could go and rig that experiment right now with the literally the contents of this, of the kitchen here. And, like, once you kind of like do that, I mean, it goes to show, though, that the terrible state of science education around the world, basically, that we can't actually grok this. But what that world looks like, and what we know from the geological record, is that we evolved in a time of actual, like, when times are actually pretty good. Storms weren't particularly huge. Milton is the norm through geological history, which should be a real kind of like wake-up call. It's like these sorts of things where you kind of like, start to sort of like push the limits of like what's actually physically. Extremes are the norm in geological history, not the clement environment that we grew up in. Because, like, if you compare the history of Earth, a few billion years with human lifetime, we're like this big.
Well, not just us, 500 million years for anything much more interesting than pond scum, right?
Yeah, and basically, like most of Earth's history now, like the dominant form of life was, like unicellular.
Right. Busy making oxygen, right? And let's think about where to take this, right? So, to your point, this has always been happening, literally forever. We're literally evolved, and all our ancestors are involved to deal with this sort of stuff. Now we're in this spot, right, where we like to build along the coastlines and we like to not get wiped out by things and I'll say it, the disinformation, the cognitive security campaigns that are going on right now, trying to convince all of us of 7 different things at the same time. We're going to be like electric monks for anybody who gets that reference. And it's, but the reality is that we like these sort of things. Like, anybody looking for some optimism, Isaac Arthur. Look up Isaac Arthur on YouTube.
Yep.
The real science guys produce huge amounts of content. A lot of it, this medium and far future, looking in terms of decades and centuries and millennia, right? And the opportunity to on those time scales over the next, could be decades, certainly over the next several centuries, we could geoengineer the earth to maintain that happy spot where we are, which is not the natural state, to your point.
No.
And
I mean, well, it's not the default. It's always been natural, but the word natural is kind of like,
comets hitting planets is also natural, right?
Yeah, it's like, but you want to sort of keep it in that sort of like happy, sort of like inverted commas, the happy spot. But the thing is that, and one of the reasons that all of this is turning out to be much more complicated than everybody thinks is that our understanding of a lot of this is actually surprisingly weak.
Right.
Like the core physics, well understood. We have natural laboratories and throughout the solar system that we can look at. We have the geological record, but when it comes to actually the really fine-grained stuff, our understanding is quite weak. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Tonga for the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit, and I ran into a famous Australian environmentalist and naturalist by the name of Tim Flannery. And he's very famous for producing books like The Future Eaters. He's a former Australian of the Year and like quite renowned inside that community. And we got talking, and it turns out that we've both been reading the same science papers, as have some of my old professors, and we all still talk. And like the amazing thing is that all of the models, for example, from the IPCC, actually, it turns out, are all wrong. We actually got our sensitivity calculations off by maybe a factor of as much as 2. So in other words, the overall system might be twice as sensitive to CO2 levels than we previously thought. And what that means is that everything that you see that is marked in these reports as 2050 to 2100 actually should really be thought of as now. Which is like, oh. And the thing is that we can manage the really gross big changes, but this fine-grained stuff needed to actually keep you inside, if you like, our comfort zone. We still haven't got a fucking clue how to do any of that. And it's the fine control. You can stop somewhere running away into being Venus, but it's this really, really fine control that we really struggle with. And we'd be better off, frankly, trying to keep the hemostatic controls, that provided by things like forests and coral reefs and so on and so forth, because those systems are actually better at self-regulating that very, very fine control than like humans. I mean, a good example of this is sulfur dioxide. So because we don't like acid rain, we decided that it would be a good idea as a planet if we stopped putting sulfur in fuel. So we took out sulfur from diesel, we took it out from aviation fuel, and we took it out from marine fuel. And the last of that to go was marine bunker fuel and marine diesel. And that happened about, I think it was like 2022, 23. And what we've seen is basically a vertical rise in temperature, because it turns out we've been running our own geoengineering experiment for the past, like 80 years, basically ever since the Royal Navy went, you know what, this whole coal thing, Coal, no good for battleships, too big, too heavy. And Winston Churchill went, you know what? We're going to use oil. We're going to turn all of our dreadnought battleships to running on oil. And at that moment, we went, right, okay, you know what? No more coal, soot, and the rest of it. The world exploded, and we suddenly started pumping all of this sulfur in sulfur dioxide into the air. And that experiment came to a pretty abrupt halt a couple of years ago. And now everything's just gone like this, straight up. Right? So we've been running this experiment, but it just goes to show how weak our actual sort of like core, like fine understanding of these fine-grained mechanisms actually is. So, you know, like, could we do it? Yeah. Could we do it with confidence?
No.
No.
Well, and I think that's as good a summation of where we are. So I feel the same way. You know, as a kid, I remember thinking that, oh, wow, I missed it. Everything's, you know, already sort of figured out, you know, and I look back at, you know, what I was reading then, you know, early 70s and so forth, and realized we didn't know anything. Like literally compared, you know, pick any individual discipline, and it was the best people on earth, you know, having this debate about these days. You go, well, we all know, I mean, literally know one of those, and the debate is now 10 layers deeper. In the same way, you know, to so many of the points you make, I don't hardly know which one to squirrel on, but looking out in the future, you know, I think it's very easy to say that 50 years from now, versions of ourselves, you know, or others will be looking back and feeling exactly like I do about 1970, which is like, it seemed we knew so much. But I just want to, you know, sort of challenge the stock public, you know, common assumption, right, is that we'll never know. It's like, that's not true either, right? These are not infinite systems. You can find the boundaries. You talk about, you know, biosystems regulating climates and so forth. You find out that a lot of the things we can take the path we're on right now. We'll just have Moore's law and we'll have faster computers. A lot of things are beyond computational management. You literally can't get there from here. So it's not that we're going to math out the
complete problem, right?
Right. You know, we're not going to, you know, there's no future version where we know where every cubic centimeter of air is moving, but we can understand the systems well enough.
And the thing to me is that, like, there are two ways that you could go. You can either devolve and decentralize the system so that, you know, like, or you can try and centrally control it all. And the problem with trying to centrally control it all is that there's a span of control problem. And I think that when it comes to trying to work out, for example, how to keep the planet livable or try and keep it within that safe, happy zone, it's big enough and complicated enough, actually, that you should just be able to, that we actually just need to be able to agree on a bunch of core principles, you know, and then it's like, okay, everybody, you know, like, you know, leave it to the trees, you know, leave it to the trees, the fish and the coral to actually do the actual, like, fine, you know, like fine tweaking of the knobs and the rest of it. And, you know, like, if we think that, like, putting sulfur back into the fuel, I mean, because then it becomes a management problem, right? Because the thing is that you end up with this situation where once you commit to actually trying to manage it yourself, you are committed to do that forever. And the minute that you take your finger off the scales and the rest of it, it will rebound to whatever the physics says, wherever the physics says that it's going to go, and out of the happy place. And that's bad, because we know from the history of humans that we are supremely bad at running anything forever. Funnily enough, actually, the closest thing to forever is actually probably the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, as it turns out, actually is the linear successor of the Roman Empire. And if you ever look at the names that the Catholic Church uses inside of its organization, like parishes, dioceses, and so on and so on, right? They're actually the lineal descendant of the Roman military province organizational structure. But that's the closest thing that we actually have to forever. So if you're going to talk about actually trying to commit to managing something forever, that's probably the closest that you've got. And that's not very old in terms of like geological history.
Well, as I've thought through all this stuff, I expect, there's such common expectation that, we're not going to live till, Wednesday, right? This again, boomer era legacy pounded into me. It's like, it's either going to be it's going to be overpopulation, 1970, 1984, 1999, 2000. The apocalypse is coming, and it turns out there's been lots of apocalypses sort of forever. And afterwards we all clean up and move on to the next one.
Yeah.
I
always tell people there will always be people. The only question will be how many and under what conditions will they live.
Right.
That's it. That is literally it. You look at civilizations through history, they kind of like go through this sort of curve where here's an example. The Mayan civilization is still there. The only difference is that they're in like the culture is still there, except they're just in little villages up in the hills and the rest of it, and they're no longer in these sort of like great cities and the rest of it, and they all speak Spanish and Quechua. But they're still there.
Right.
They're not a dominant, hyper dominant civilization anymore. So for us, the aim of the game should be we want to like keep ourselves. We as individuals want to stay alive, but also like we quite like our civilization as it is. So we want to make sure that all of that knowledge survives and our ability to do things like not die from a paper cut or I mean, like one of the most amazing things that you can do is it turns out that you can actually directly trace the history of vaccines by going to a cemetery that has been in continuous use for the last like couple of 100 years and go to the children's section.
Oh yeah, do your ancestry tree at some point, and you go back a couple generations. All these little leaves.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, everyone died before they were like 5.
Well, either giving birth or being born was the most dangerous thing we could do before.
And then like you made it to 35, and you're suddenly like, you know what? Actually, I'm good. It's life dysentery. I've had all that shit. I'm good.
Well, it's so common. Folks our age, right? Just love to get into the, oh my god, I'm so old, this hurts, and everything else. I'm sorry, I just go through the whole thing. Bonus rounds. Hey, look.
Yeah.
I remember to the point that this is actually just wearing out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like oh, you're old enough now that's a problem. Guess what? That's something that like your ancestors just didn't have because they didn't have aches and pains because they were dead.
That's right. 37. Oh, you poor old man. You got all your limbs still.
So like the aim of the game should be, it's like we enjoy all of this stuff. And the aim of the game should be, well, we actually want to make sure that our descendants, your kids, and their kids like can enjoy the same stuff. It might be slightly different stuff, but we want them to have the same sort of like broad, fulfilling lives that we in our incredibly varied careers have taken for granted. Right.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into just looking forward, right? And just in my own experience, right? The things I've seen in emergency response and disaster recovery of all sorts, cyber and physical and whatnot. And what Rakesh and I were talking about in the 20, 25, 30 years, that he's been, involved with that. When you see right now, we have Starlink, showing up in the middle of emergency response. Now you got 150 megabits, broadband. That changes a lot of things. And we, quadcopters and drones. I look out 5 years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Our ability to respond to disasters like we're seeing right now will be fundamentally, for conversation purposes, fundamentally different. If I can send out not just, helicopters, from enthusiasts and people who happen to have helicopters, but just a fleet of bloody drones to find every individual within 90 minutes, assess them, and we won't imagine being able to go back to where we are today.
I actually think somewhat differently, which is one of the problems that we have is that we've built a bunch of systems that are in fact actually both ubiquitous and actually very brittle. And it's that brittleness that is actually a problem. So, yes, Starlink is great. The problem with these constellations, for example, is that you can only have a couple of them.
Right.
And they are actually, in many respects, quite vulnerable.
Well, but let's just ratchet forward real quick on that. So that, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I love, I love SpaceX. That company is amazing. The stuff they're doing, everybody there, it's not very controversial these days. But there's only one of them. That makes me nervous. I'm a security geek. Anything can happen to one of anything. But just inside this topic, you just assume that if I was, responsible, give me a 10-year timeline and a reasonable budget to develop, a disaster response drone, fleet capability. You could, drop in a container into some place like Dandridge, Tennessee, and have it up all the valleys and find all the people. Yeah, you can do that, and it doesn't need any. You take brittleness and fragility, and some of them are going to die, and some of them are going to run into trees, and some of them battery, they won't be able to get a connection. You can build that with today's tech.
You can,
and the cost of not having that becomes enough to actually have that. So I think that's the kind of thing you can realistically forecast, 1 and 2 decades out, that emergency response turns in, the time it takes, the time it has taken in North Carolina to get to some of these folks. Just probably got to them all by now, but you never know. It gets really windy up there in those little.
No. I mean, the thing is the other thing to bear in mind as well is that I was told, like it's the classic William Gibson quote: "The future is already here; it's just not evenly distributed." And in my mind, I tend to take quite pessimistic is the wrong word.
Realistic?
Yeah, possibly realistic. Realistic's not a bad word. So we kind of have this. Both of us grew up in a world of essentially a world that wasn't actually at war. And this is not, again,
the norm.
The norm is, in fact, actually a state of pretty much permanent warfare. If you look at the history of the United Kingdom, for example, it's actually been at war with France for most of it.
Or itself the rest of the time.
Although, yeah, basically. It's like there was always war somewhere, usually with France, often with somebody else into the mix. But one of the fascinating things about the second half of the 21st century, in my mind, is that we now have a state, or the second 2/3 of the 21st century, is that once again, we have a state of permanent war, but not war. And the thing that actually I find actually most fascinating is, especially when it comes to the cyber stuff, is that you end up in a state of war, but not war. It's undeclared war, but it's still fundamentally war. And what I find fascinating is that, for example, Russian botnets amplifying the disinformation and misinformation, which is actually now impeding the response to Hurricane Helene, and now threatening to actually get people killed.
Oh, it has.
Of Florida. Yeah. Because, you have things saying, no, don't evacuate, and so.
Well, you don't have to stop there. With as a binational family, right, with Canada and the U.S. to compare at the same time during the pandemic, if the U.S. had the same per capita COVID death rate as Canada, there would be 700,000 Americans alive today.
Correct.
Right, and so we're past the point of potentially killing people with disinformation. And in fact, I think that's, again, if I switched hats, if I was a bad actor, I would be more concerned with my ability to run free in the disinformation space not lasting much longer, because the costs are getting high enough that we have to find ways around this. If we're stuck in this, again, over the long curves, the state of not having any agreement about what exists, if this stays like this or continues getting worse forever, we can't have electricity.
Yeah, we're fucked.
Yeah.
That's actually the thing, and that's one of the things that's actually really interesting, is that this appears to be a generational thing. So again, but the question is can we sustain ourselves through this transitional phase to younger people who have a much better set of information hygiene in their heads, because they've grown up in an environment where everything is hostile. But the thing is that they're not in charge
yet. That's right.
yet. Well, I mean, like, if you've noticed, like the boomers are still fucking in charge, because they make up the largest voting bloc. After this election, they won't. But right now, in this set of elections that's happening globally, the boomers are still the largest voting, the largest effective voting bloc. Even though they're not an absolute majority, they're the ones that still come out and vote. And that's why 2024 is such a pivotal year, because it's like, if you end up with another 4 years of institutional decay, chaos, etc., like, that's super bad news, because your ability to sustain yourself and recover in the next 30 may be really badly impacted. Like, the only thing that gives me any hope at all is the fact that when you talk to really young kids, in their late teens, early 20s, not even in their late teens, like mid-teens to their 20s, they are far more aware and skeptical about like what YouTube and the algorithms actually feeding them. But that also explains why basically, like Zuckerberg and like elongated rodent and the rest of these. Am I allowed to swear on this thing?
Sure, it's the internet. We can say anything we like.
The rest of these fucking pricks are so absolutely terrified of this generational change, because that generation's coming up has far less tolerance for their fucking bullshit than ours does and the boomers do. I mean, every billionaire is an institutional failure, and giving billionaires effectively personal rights to shape our information environment is a catastrophe, because they don't serve our interests. They're not even interested in keeping the planet livable, because, like, if you ask Elon, it's like, I'm going to fuck off to Mars. And it's like, well, enjoy cancer, buddy. And so because we've handed that over to them, certainly here in the West, we've handed that over to them. It's their interests that shape that information environment, and they're all about low taxes, want to fuck off to Mars, and if they want to live on some like compound out in the South Pacific and the rest of, while the rest of us drown, they don't care. But if you talk to these much younger people, they are riven with everything from climate. I mean, like, one of the saddest things recently, actually, I was talking to a friend of mine, has a 14-year-old daughter, and that daughter has a self-harm problem. And when asked about like self-harm problems, more often than not have to do with feelings of loss of control.
Right.
And terrifyingly, it is actually climate anxiety that actually in her case, that actually drives some of that behavior, because they feel that the world around them is out of control, and the adults who should be in charge and looking out for interests are not.
Well, I have 3 kids in their 20s, right? So I feel this one very, very deeply. And I for anybody out there, listening to us old guys talk about this, you're going to have it tomorrow. You just are. Right? You'll have challenges to deal with, maybe really bad ones, probably really bad ones, and then there's mortality at the end of it. So I don't think that, and I know we could talk about this stuff forever. We have to end at some point, but I think this is the sort of thing. My work with folks like you and Rakesh and the whole security world, networking world, emergency response, humanitarian stuff. is that we will just continue to get better at this stuff. We'll continue to have existential crises. There's always going to be a Vogon battle fleet coming to destroy Earth, but we'll work it through. And I couldn't agree with you more that I think a lot of this is generational. I don't think I am wired correctly in the head to, fully understand how we're going to do some of this stuff. But I can see a generation growing up that is.
We need to be much more okay with the idea of like, you know what? I don't have all the answers. These old fucking guys certainly don't have all the answers, and the rest of it. You know what? Why don't we ask why don't we ask the young people? Why don't we ask the ones who actually have like a real
stake in it?
A stake in it, yeah. And like the wise leaders listen to all of their stakeholders, to use like corporate horse bollocks speech. But in this particular case, like the stakeholders actually in this particular case are a bunch of like 13 and 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds, right? And actually, because ultimately, especially when you're talking about things like the climate and the rest of it, the decisions that we make today are irreversible on the 20 to 30 to 50 year, 1,000-year time frame, right? So in other words, if we are, as it looks like, committed just with the amount of CO2 that's in the air right now to somewhere in the region of 2 degrees of warming, right? That's enough to tip us out of the environment that contemporary Homo sapiens grew up in. That is enough to tip us out of the environment that all of our principal food species grew up in, like evolved in, right? And what that means is that actually, like, we now need to start thinking in terms of, like, it's not like the world winks out of existence when I pop my clogs, because I can do that just go crossing the road here quite easily. I just need to stand out in the middle of Rhode Island Avenue and just say, come get me, right? Like, we need to actually really start thinking about this in terms of like, okay, well, what's the effect for the next generation and the generation after that? And then actually start. And you know what? They're right in front of us. When that 14-year-old like shows up with a bleeding arm and the rest of it, and like when you ask them, well, why do you cut yourself? And they say, well, the world is spiraling out of control. Literally everything's on fire, and like I can't see a future. We should actually listen. We shouldn't just go, oh, you know what? It's all right. We're just going to put you some antidepressants, and like everything will be fine. And like let's go back to like counting all the zeros in my fucking bank account, because you know what? That is totally synthetic, and those wounds and those scars remain.
Right.
Wow. We need to start doing a lot better by these folks. And like, so the way that I think about things is that we should be building for a much deeper set of resilience. We should not be saying, well, you know what, if we just build the house of cards just higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, like, and if I'm just the guy building like the house, the last couple of steps on the house of cards, everything's going to be fine. It's like, well, actually, we actually do run risks of kind of like basal collapses. And so what we need to actually do is say, well, okay, if we're going to think about engineering, well, like, do we always engineer, for example, for an always online environment? And I would answer, that's actually a really stupid idea. Don't do that. Because, like, human agency will ensure that you will not always have an always online environment. I mean, Starlink is a brilliant example of this, right? Starlink's like, it's a universal always online environment. You know what? Half a dozen ASAT missiles and the rest of it, and that's it. It's game over the whole system.
Well, yeah, I'm going to end on a positive note, because I think that it is the whole point. And, I think that, a lot of the answers that we'll find, that again, these may be outside my, survivable age range. It may take, another 50 years or so forth to work through it, but I see it in the hands in the mouths of my kids' generation, which is
Yeah,
mental.
absolutely.
Right. We have so much room to improve so that we ourselves individually can enjoy this world. And I think a mentally healthy world will come up with solutions to all these issues so much faster than we muddle through right now. That may be the key by itself. Just maybe 50 and 100 years from now, people are just way better in their heads, so they're not going through all the agony of
I
addressing
think
it.
actually,
Just stressing it.
I honestly think that actually, like a really good start would be simply getting it into people's heads that the endless pursuit of like 9 or 10 or have 12 zeros or have much of some fictitious value in the rest of it actually isn't the be all and end all of existence.
No, as the great philosopher John and Ringo told us, money can't buy me love.
Yeah.
But and we're well.
I mean,
So at that point, we're going to take it into the green room because we're getting to the length limits here. So thank you, Emerson.
No problem.
Thank you, everyone, for coming along. And we will catch you with the robotic camera next time.
All right. Very good.
Thanks.